Namaste everyone, thanks for tuning in. Today's opponent ranking is 1202. Let's play. I moved my pawn at e6. Opponent moved his bishop at c4. I moved my pawn at d6. Opponent moved his pawn at d4. I moved my pawn at c6. Opponent moved his pawn at d5. I move my knight at f6. Opponent takes my pawn at e6. I takes opponent pawn at e6. Opponent takes my bishop at e6. Opponent moved his knight at c3. I move my knight at d7. Opponent moved its knight at f3. I move my knight at e5. Opponent takes my knight at e5. I takes opponent knights at e5. Opponent takes my queen at d8. I captures opponent's queen at d8. Opponent castles. I move my bishop at e7. Opponent moves its bishop at e3. I move my bishop at f6. Opponent moves its rook at d1. Check on my king. Op Opponent moved his bishop at c5. Check on my king. I move my king at f7. Opponent moved his pawn at f4. I captures opponent's pawn at f4. Opponent's rook captures my pawn at f4. I move my pawn at e5. Opponent moves his rook at f5. I move my rook at e8. Opponent moved his pawn at g4. I move my king at g8. Opponent moved his pawn at h4. I captures opponent pawn at h4. Opponent moved his pawn at g5. I move my bishop at g3. Opponent moved its bishop at d6. I move my pawn at d6. Opponent moves its rook at f1. I move my bishop at f4. Opponent moved its pawn at b4. I move my knight at d7. Opponent moves its knight at e2. I captures opponent pawn at g5. Opponent moves its pawn at c4. I move my bishop at e7. Opponent captures my bishop at e7. I captures opponent's bishop at e7. Opponent moved its pawn at a4. I move my knight at b6. Opponent moves its pawn at c5. I move my knight at c4. Opponent moves its rook at c1. I move my knight at d2. Opponent moved its rook at c2. I captures opponent's rook at f1. King captures my knight at f1. I move my rook at f7 with check on opponent's king. Opponent move his king at g2. I move my king at g7. Opponent moved its knight at g3. I move my rook at d7. Opponent moved its rook at c3. I move my rook at d8. Opponent moved its pawn at a5. I move my rook at d2. Check on opponent's king. Opponent move its king on s3. I move my rook at d3, threatening opponent's rook. I move my opponent moves its rook on c2. I move my rook on b3. Opponent moved its rook on c4. I move my rook on d3 and opponent surrender.